Hi, everyone. First of all, welcome. Thank you very much for spending your time this evening joining us on this webinar on everything you know about whiskey investment. I'm Freeman, and I'm the in-house whiskey specialist for Rare Finds Worldwide. We are a whiskey cask trader. So today, the things that we would cover includes some of the basics regarding Scotch whiskey in general. We will be mostly talking about investing in whiskey cask, things that are specific to casks, and we will do a little bit of comparison between investing in whiskey bottles and comparing to investing in whiskey cask. And also, we will teach you how to generally value a cask of whiskey. So if you guys have any questions in between or during the process, feel free to put them into the chat room or in the Q&A. I'll try to address all the questions towards the end of the session. And after the session, I'll still be around for a couple of minutes to answer any questions that you guys might have. So without further ado, let us begin. So the first thing that when we consider investing in whiskey is, of course, whether we know about what exactly is Scotch whiskey and why do we want to choose to invest in Scotch whiskey versus other whiskeys in the world. So it's important to note that Scotch whiskey is actually a very, very old industry with more than 2 centuries of history. It is considered very, very highly regulated by the Scotch Whiskey Regulation. And there are a lot of very specific and transparent rules that defines what is Scotch whiskey. However, if we strip away all the fancy and complicated rules, in essence, Scotch whiskey is a distilled grain or distilled malt spirit that has been aged in an oak cask for at least 3 years. However, there are 5 different categories of Scotch whiskey, which we would actually go through one by one. And it is very important to know that when we talk about investing in whiskey, which categories are we actually focusing on and which categories that we should actually avoid. So the first category of whiskey, which is also the cornerstone of the entire Scotch whiskey industry, is what we refer to as the blended whiskey. So samples of blended whiskey would be the usual big brands that you can see in supermarkets or liquor store, the likes of Johnnie Walker, Chivas Regal, Ballantine, so on and so on. So these whiskeys actually make up to over 95% of the volume of whiskeys being consumed. However, in terms of value, they also make up to 75% of the value, which means that blended whiskey is the largest part, the majority of what Scotch whiskey actually is. However, when we talk about investing in whiskey, most of the time we are not referring to blended whiskey. We're mostly referring to single malt Scotch whiskey. The reason is that a blended whiskey is generally created by for the general public's appetite. It is created to create a homogeneous and consistent flavor of the brand, and its volume is extremely large. So the definition of blended whiskey is a whiskey that is a blend between a grain and a malt spirit that comes from more than one distillery. Therefore, there is no limit as to a particular brand, how many bottles a particular brand of blended whiskey can have. It can be 1,000, it can be 10,000, it can be 100, or it can even be 1,000,000 bottles of the exactly same whiskey. You can blend as many casks together as you possibly want. So therefore, even though it makes up to the majority of the whiskey market, when people talk about investing in whiskey, they do not generally target blended whiskey. So the next category is blended malt. So a blended malt means that it's a 100% malt spirit, but it's blended with spirits coming from more than one distillery. So here, blended means that it's from more than one distillery, and malt means that it's always malt spirit. This is a relatively speaking small category. It makes up to less than 1% of the market, and it's also generally not considered as an investment category. The next is a blended grain. So a blended grain is a 100% grain spirit that comes from more than one distillery in the world. Again, the word blended means it comes from more than one distillery. and grain means that it's 100% grain spirit. Similar to blended malt, it's generally not considered as a investment grade whiskey, not an investment category. Grain whiskies are of incredibly large supply. So there are roughly around 7 to 8 active grain distilleries in Scotland, and their production volume is larger than the 150 malt distilleries all put together. Therefore, there's a virtually endless supply of grain whiskey. And even though with age, they still increase in value, but they do not increase as much as single malt whiskey. Therefore, generally not an investment target. Same goes for single grain. Here, single means that it's coming from only one distillery. So there's no mixture between from products between various distilleries. It can still be a mixture between a lot of different casks. If you find a bottle of single grain whiskey, however, it's only from one distillery and it's 100% grain spirit. And last but not least, we have our category of focus for today. When people talk about investing in whiskey, most of the time they talk about single malt. Single here meaning that it's from one particular distillery, and malt being that it's 100% malt spirit. So the reason people only invest in single malt whiskey is because of its sheer variety that makes connoisseurs and collectors pursue. So there are hundreds of single malt distilleries in the world, and there are more than 150 single malt distilleries in Scotland alone. And each of every one of them has a different production method. They have a different geography leading to different ingredients being used, leading to also different shapes of the still will create a different distillate character. So every single product from different distilleries have its very own unique characteristics, which gives the variety of flavors in different brands of single malt. This variety is what generally connoisseurs and collectors will try to collect and pursue and treat it as much more as a hobby than a drink, which is what leads to a collectible market being able to develop. It hence becomes a investment grade product when people starting to collect and hoard. And over the years, as certain bottles become famous for its renowned flavor, and when certain distilleries becomes famous for its renowned profile, people try to pursue more and more, hence creating the ever increasing supply. Hence, it becomes something investors will further pursue. So now let's talk about how single malt is actually being made. So the process is actually much more simple than most people would imagine. So since single malt is using 100% malt, the raw material is barley. Therefore, the first step is to harvest barley. To turn barley into malt, you have to go through a process of malting, which is soaking it in water and then drying it through a kiln. It is then being milled down into finer pieces and then soaked into warm water through a process called mashing. Mashing basically just means trying to extract all the sugar contents into the water, creating a sugary solution. The sugary solution is then added with yeast to ferment, creating alcohol. This low alcohol content liquid would then put through a still through double distillation to raise its alcohol content to roughly around 70 to 80 ABV level, and then it is hence diluted slightly at around 63.5% ABV and being put into a cask for maturation. Maturation has to be at least 3 years in minimal to be legally called Scotch whisky. Afterwards, it can be bottled into your drink. So when people talk about investing in whiskey, most people would be referring to either process number 8 or process number 9, which is either buying whiskeys in a form of a cask or in a form of a bottle. These two different approaches are quite drastically different, in fact, in terms of both its return and in terms of the method that you get, the sort of method that you can trade. So when investing in bottle, people really rely heavily on the hype and on the popularity of that particular bottle. So when you are able to hit on limited editions, single cask release, from very hyped distilleries or from close distilleries, from very famous bottlers, you will be able to generate a huge return within a short period of time. In fact, for people who invest in bottles for the past 10 years, according to the Knight Frank World Report, rare bottles of whiskeys have increased in value for over 580% through the past 10 years, which is very, very decent. However, when there's huge winners, there are also some losers in the bottle market. If in case you bought something and it turns out not being a very popular bottle or receives a bad review from a critic, it might not increase in value over time. Therefore, you're either going to have to drink it or you will have to sell the bottle at a discount. But with some bottles, for example, like the Highland Park 50-year-old, when it first released in 2015, just within 3 years, the value has tripled. So with bottles, the price fluctuation is actually quite large, but there are definitely huge winners. But with casks, generally speaking, investing in casks is a much more price rigid and much lower risk form of investing in whiskeys. The reason is because when you invest in a cask, what you are actually aiming for is its intrinsic value increase, as well as the age increase that derives from the opportunity that you can age the cask. So aging the cask is a very, very important aspect if you want to buy a cask of whiskey as an investment. So again, as mentioned, with bottles of whiskey, the increase in value comes from the demand and supply, the hype, the marketing that it generates. However, with cask of whiskey, the increase in value comes from two things. First, the oak is going to interact with the spirits inside the oak cask. It's going to create complexity. It's going to absorb the flavor from the oak, and the harshness from the spirit is going to dissipate with time. Therefore, just generally making the spirit a more pleasant drink, a more complex drink, hence a better product. This better product would hence be able to ask for a higher price in the market. The second reason is the most important reason is the age statement. So the price of a whiskey is hugely correlated with its age. So if you go to a supermarket and you see a bottle of whiskey, you can see that despite the taste, the older the whiskey, it's always more expensive, the price. Taste is very personal. Some people might prefer younger spirits. Some people might prefer older spirits. But when it comes to price, older spirits are always more expensive. So unlike wine, whiskeys do not age in a bottle. Therefore, if you buy a bottle of whiskey that's 12 years old, no matter how long you put it, it's still considered as a 12-year-old whiskey. It might grow in value due to its rarity, or due to it being a lot of it being consumed, or due to its antique value over many, many decades, but it's still a 12-year-old. But if you buy a cask of whiskey, then every year you age it, the legal age of the whiskey increases. Hence, what you are earning is that increased value derived from the age. The older the whiskey, the more expensive it is. It's also worth noting that an whiskey cannot be aged indefinitely due to its physical limitations. So there is a natural scarcity that comes with the age. The reason being that every year you age a whiskey, there is roughly around 2% loss in the alcohol called the angel's share due to a natural evaporation. And there's also 0.5% loss in the alcohol level. With this, because the law does state that whiskey has to be higher than 40% ABV. Therefore, if a cask of whiskey is overaged and its alcohol level has dropped below 40% ABV, it can no longer be considered as a whiskey, which means that a cask cannot be aged indefinitely. So with this assumption, you can actually imagine that most casks actually do not reach the age of, let's say, 40 or 50 or 60. Casks that are able to age and still survive beyond this sort of age is essentially a freak of nature, and they are extremely rare. Hence, their price are exponentially increased in the market. It's also due to the fact that most whiskeys in the market are actually being consumed between 12 to 20 years old. Most casks in the market, hence, are being bottled at this sort of age, leaving very small volume of casks still being aged beyond 20 years old. Hence, old whiskeys are naturally rare. And there are also really popular ages with whiskeys. As you can see in the market, most whiskeys are bottled at 12 years old, 18 years old, 25 years old, 30 years old. So when whiskeys hit these sort of age, it becomes an excellent timing to sell your cask. Because at this age, we often see a spike in value, and those would be the perfect period for investors to sell. Historically speaking, over the past few decades, for each year a cask is being aged, its value increases roughly around 15%. So this this number is actually for whiskeys across the board. Therefore, meaning that if you're actually able to pick investment grade distilleries, famous distilleries, investment grade whiskeys, you can easily beat 15% per year in terms of annual return, which is, I would dare to say, better than most investment choice in the market. So it's also worth noting that whiskey do actually act as a natural hedge to the general economic situation, due to the fact that it's just sitting in a warehouse creating value from intrinsically being a better product with time, instead of purely relying on supply and demand. Investors and high net worth individuals actually generally treat Scotch whisky as a risk haven. And Scotch, it's worth noting that even during economic downturns like the 2008 economic crash, Scotch whisky investment market and consumer market has not declined a bit. And even during last year's COVID period, we have seen whiskey prices soar throughout the entire 2020, and it has been performing better than ever. Therefore, even during economic uncertainty, even during the pandemic, whiskey is generally a very reliable asset class to invest. So the market size of whiskey is still considerably large. So last year, according to the Scotch Whisky Association, Scotch whisky actually makes up of contributes to 75% of the entire Scottish food and drinks export, and 21% of the entire UK food and drinks export. So the whiskey exports market has increased by 4.4% in 2019, and we do expect it to keep it up in 2020 and 2021 as well. So it's not only the volume of whiskey being consumed has increased, we've also seen the variety of single malts being released, as well as the average value of bottles of Scotch whisky increased significantly. So according to Whisky Base, the research we've done on Whisky Base, in 2014, there's actually roughly around 6,000 different whiskeys being released. However, in 2018, this number has jumped close to 9,000. So what we observe is that people are seeking variety. They are seeking limited editions, single cask release, but not just general official bottlings and general core range whiskeys. They're treating it, more people are treating it as a hobby, as a collection, as something to taste rather than just a general drink. We've also seen a spike of average value of whiskeys being bought throughout the years. So in 2019, the average value of whiskey that appears in auction has increased from £378 to £401, so a 6.12 increase in average value, meaning that people are actually paying for more variety of whiskeys, paying more for an average bottle of whiskey, and drinking more whiskey in general. So the single malt, it's worth noting that the single malt market is actually targeted to reach £2.74 billion by 2025. So if we want to consider buying a cask of whiskey, of course, we have to first understand where these casks actually come from, as well as how to value it. So the fundamental production unit of Scotch whisky is, of course, the distilleries. So the distilleries would produce these spirits every year and fill them into oak casks and allow them to mature in warehouses. Understanding the power of aging, and also because distilleries are actually foreseeing the demand or in the future market in 10 to 15 years, because whiskeys are generally bottled at 10 to 15 years old, they will often produce much more spirits than they actually sell every year. They would therefore hence sell these casks to private individuals, independent bottlers, trading customers, and also institutional investors. These independent bottlers, of course, they also understand the cost of the power of aging, the value that it creates with aging whiskey. Therefore, they will also trade these casks further down the trade line to other individuals who are interested in owning a cask of whiskey, who are interested in trading whiskey or investing in whiskey, or someone who simply enjoys whiskey or would like to own a cask. These whiskey casks that have left the distilleries and sold to the secondary market creates a ecosystem where whiskey casks are being traded freely in the secondary market, which is a unique ecosystem that only happens in Scotch whiskies. These casks are often owned by collectors, independent bottlers, private individuals, institutional investors, and they are being traded actually rather frequently as an investment or as an asset. So in order to be able to value a cask, the best way to do it is to make comparisons to bottles in the market. Unfortunately, unlike stocks or unlike like bond prices or other financial instruments, cask prices are not as transparent and it's not easily accessible on the internet. However, what apparently is very, very transparent are retail prices nowadays. You can actually find any bottle retail price as long as it's available on Google nowadays. Therefore, the best way to actually value a cask is to compare it with retail prices at a discount. But to be able to accurately compare retail prices with bottles, you have to choose bottles that actually have the same parameters and the same specifications as the cask that you are about to purchase. And this requires some knowledge and fundamental knowledge between the differences between independent bottlings and official bottlings, as well as batch whiskey and single cask. So official bottlings refers to whiskeys that are released directly from the distilleries. For example, if you see a bottle of let's say Macallan 12 or Highland Park 18 years old in the supermarket with their logo on it, those are official bottlings. Those are often also batch whiskeys that are created by blending many different casks, still from the same distillery. Therefore, it's still single malt, but they do not just come from one cask. They come from hundreds and hundreds of casks being blended together to create a consistent and homogeneous product. So independent bottling, however, are companies that do not necessarily own distilleries. They do not produce the spirits themselves, but they would buy whiskeys from other distilleries and bottle it under their own label. These whiskeys still tell you which distilleries they are from. For example, they would say, let's say, for example, famous independent bottler Gordon MacPhail, they would say it's a whiskey from Gordon MacPhail, but distilled at Bowmore Distillery, for example. However, they do not carry the Bowmore trademark. They carry the Gordon and MacPhail trademark. A lot of these whiskeys are single cask whiskeys, meaning that they are only drawn from one cask, meaning that it only has a limited number of bottles available. If a cask can yield, for example, 300 bottles, then this whiskey has 300 bottles. If it yields 500 bottles, then this whiskey has 500 bottles, meaning that they are very, very limited by nature. So when you buy a cask of whiskey, you from the secondary market, most of the time you are buying a cask that comes from an independent bottler, and it is a single cask. So when you look for products to compare in the retail market, you have to make sure you look into independent bottling and you look into single cask offerings. Of course, there's still a lot of other factors that affect the price. For example, you have to compare it with the exactly the same cask type. You shouldn't compare a bourbon cask to a sherry cask because they do yield different prices in the market. You should also avoid comparing with antique bottlings. Antique bottlings means that it could be named as the same whiskey. For example, Macallan 18-year-old that's released in 2020. But you should not compare it with a Macallan 18-year-old that's released in, for example, the 1980s. This is because old whiskies have natural increase in value due to its antique value, historical value, and due to it being incredibly scarce because throughout the years of history, it has been, most of them has been consumed. Therefore, if you compare a cask, let's say a Macallan 18-year-old cask Nowadays, with the value of a Macallan 18-year-old whiskey from the 1980s, very likely you are going to overvalue it. You should always compare bottles that are released from the past 10 years only. So to estimate price of a cask, you take the retail price of a similar product in the market, you minus the sales margin for roughly around 20%, but you also add in a little bit of, you minus duties and bottling costs, but you add in a little bit of premium for aging potential, which is roughly around 10 to 15%, then you get a rough estimate of a fair cask price. So this here is a model that we often use called the DCI model to find the right cask for the right person. So the DCI refers to drinkers, collectors, and investors. This generally tells you, depending on what type of person you are, what type of cask you should always target. For example, a drinker often always care about quality and they care about CP value. They care about whether something is good value. Therefore, a drinker can often consider buying a cask from maybe a lower value cask from a lesser known distillery, something that is decently aged, maybe 15 to 25 years old, that gives you very, very good value for money. For an investor and collector, of course, they want to target something maybe relatively premium, especially for collectors from renowned distilleries, maybe something from a better age and just generally of a higher caliber. However, no matter what category of whiskey buyer you are, just generally speaking, we advise people to avoid very, very young casks that are offered at very, very cheap price or from new distilleries in general. There are actually a lot of casks available in the market from newly built distilleries that have not yet released any Scotch product, but they have spirits that are just being produced and aging in the warehouse that are between 0 to 3 years old. Not legally Scotch whiskey yet, but still they are potentially Scotch whiskey. So they are incredibly cheap from time to time. Sometimes you can just get them for just around 2,000 to 3,000 pounds. However, the problem with these is that because they do not carry a legitimate, well-known brand name, there are a lot of uncertainties involved with the future value of these whiskies. They are not ready to be tasted yet because they're so young. Therefore, drinkers will not buy it. Due to its uncertainty, investors will not buy it. And due to its lack of brand name, collectors will not buy it. So if you are stuck with a cask like it, it's very difficult for you to resell it into the market if you are an investor. But with casks from renowned distilleries, none of these problems exist. Drinkers would drink it. Investors and collectors would buy them because they are high quality, because they come from renowned distilleries, and because there is a market for it. The liquidity of these casks are hence much better. Therefore, we always suggest clients to always look for casks from distilleries that are considered as investment grade, that are famous, that is at least at the top 50 distilleries in Scotch. So there's a lot of factors that affect the price of whiskey, obviously. The most important factor, again, I cannot stress this enough, is the distillery. So the distillery tells you about the quality of the spirit, the marketing tactics, the ownership behind it, whether it's owned by a global conglomerate that markets it really well, or is it a family-owned distillery that still stays independent with a lot of history and heritage behind it. These would all affect the value of whiskey. The fame and the history, everything tied to it will boost up its value because the passion, the romance behind whiskey is very, very important factor to consider. The next very important factor is the age. Although being that important, it's actually very simple. With whiskeys, older always means higher price. Again, taste is very, very subjective. Some people prefer younger spirits, some people prefer older spirits. But with the price, older always means more expensive. That's where the whole premise, the core principle of investing in whiskey cask is to be able to age it. So the next important factor is the cask type. So when you come across a sherry cask, there's often a premium to it. So right now in the industry, 90% of the casks being used are bourbon and 10% of the casks are sherry. Sherry often asks for roughly around 20% premium when compared to a bourbon cask of the same age from the same distillery. However, bourbon cask is still generally the core range of what people would trade. It's very popular and it's very solid in terms of value. There is less than 1% of other types of quirky casks in the market, including but not limited to a wine cask, rum cask, beer cask, brandy cask, and all sorts of other casks. So these casks, although being incredibly rare, because they are not the general norm of casks being used, they do not actually add value due to its rarity. But for some people, there are novelty values in some of these casks, and I would still say that they are generally good investments. What is not as important when compared to the other three factors is the vintage. So the vintage is incredibly important when it comes to wine, but with whiskeys, just generally speaking, the age is much more important. The older is always better. The vintage is just a number. Some people might aim for vintages of the birth of the son, the birth of themselves, the birth of their marriage, but generally there isn't any particular number that is specifically good for whiskeys. ABV, again, in terms of value, it doesn't add a lot, but what is very important about ABV is its aging potential. As mentioned, the whiskey cannot be under 40% ABV. Therefore, for every single year you age it, it loses 0.5%. So the ABV level when you buy the cask tells you how long you can potentially age it. If you are aiming to hold on to a cask for 10 to 20 years, you have to buy a whiskey that has a very old, has a very high ABV. So there are casks, of course, comes with different sizes. We've got obviously very tiny casks that are called blood tub, octave, quarter casks. These casks can be of any content, basically. They can be bourbon, they can be sherry, they can be wine. They are just created to increase the rate of aging, and they are generally not considered as good investment because they are not suitable for long-term aging. What is most commonly seen are American standard barrels and hogsheads. So American standard barrels are always bourbon. Hogsheads can be bourbon or sherry. We've also got port pipes, which have been filled with port, and we have gigantic casks that are only sherry, that are sherry butt or sherry punch on. These are casks with over 500 liters. Of course, with more content, the price is higher, but we always also look at the average value per liter or per bottle. So again, a very important factor to consider is the distillery. So I'm now going to give you guys some tips on what distilleries to actually aim for. There are more than 150 active distilleries in Scotland, and only around the top 50 of them we actually consider as investment grades. So obviously the top three right now are Macallan, Bowmore, and Dalmore. These would be the ones that often hit over 500,000 Hong Kong dollars a bottle in auction prices. These whiskies have increased in price so much for the past decade, and we do not see them slowing down anytime soon. So if you can afford it, these are basically the blue chips of whiskies. Other than these three, we have some very, very strong front runners, the likes of Lefroy, Springbank, Heinisch, Ardbeg, Lagavulin, Glendronach, etc., and etc. These whiskies have also performed extremely well. They are all incredibly famous, incredibly hyped. It's just that they have not reached the status of, for example, 500,000 Hong Kong dollars a bottle, but they generally their casks are still very, very good investments for the past few years. If you have bought a Lefroy cask, for example, 2 years ago, very likely you have already made 50 or 60% in terms of asset value increase. Other than these, we have some solid and strong options. These are whiskies that have a strong history, very strong, a very strong fan base around the world that makes incredibly delicious quality spirits and a very safe choice. The likes of Coonawarra, Highland Park, Mortlach, Bruichladdich, etc., etc. These whiskies, I would say, are suitable for any sort of investors to increase. They are still fairly decently priced, very good value. So there's a lot of upside, and but still they are considered very, very famous. And every day there are people asking for casks like these. And if you're more speculative in terms of the in terms of investment, of course, you can look for some rising stars, Glenelgan, Glenkeith, Lechick, Ben Reens, Ben Nevis, for example. if you're not a whiskey geek or whiskey enthusiast, it's very likely you have never heard of any of these, but they are distilleries that are very, very popular in the independent bottling market. And some of them have increased in price many, many folds for the past few years. For example, a bottle of 20-year-old Ben Nevis would have cost only around 1,000 Hong Kong dollars 5 years ago. But currently, it would cost roughly around 2,500 Hong Kong dollars because the brand name, the general hype of the distillery has increased so much just simply by being well performing in the independent bottling market. So some of these casks are generally cheaper when compared to other ones that I've mentioned previously, but they are generally very good investments as well. So if you're interested in buying casks, of course, talk to us. We will establish a goal, a reason for you to buy a cask. You might want to buy it for anniversary. Some people might want to buy it for celebration. Some people buy purely for financial reasons, for investments. It's very important to understand why you want to do it to be able to find the right cask for you. If you're doing it purely for financial reasons, how long do you want to hold a cask? What is your budget? Do you have any distilleries of preference? After we understand these, we will be able to show you various different offers in the market continuously so that you will be able to browse through a lot of different offers in the market to find the right cask. Once you've decided to purchase, these casks will be stored in Scotland in bonded warehouse licensed by the HMRC. They would be aging there managed by professionals, and they will mature with time, and eventually when it's the right time to sell, we will be able to put your cars back into the market through various channels, including but not limited to, for example, auction house, online auctions, our retail network, our customer network, as well as other private channels. So all the cars that we buy, we do target at least a 15% per annual cask investment yield in general. Therefore, again, I cannot stress this enough, they are generally considered as very safe, high yield investments when compared to most other asset class. So once you've bought a cask, of course, again, these casks will be stored in third-party licensed bonded, HMRC licensed bonded warehouse with bottling plant. Therefore, if you bought a cask and you wish to age it, you can, if you wish to bottle it, you can bottle it. You can draw a sample for your cask so that you can follow up on the progress. You can taste your cask for fun. You can find the right time to bottle. You will be able to visit your cask should you visit Scotland, obviously. You are able to re-rack your cask into other types of casks. So for example, if you bought a bourbon cask whiskey, if you want to change it into a sherry cask, we can do that for you as well. It will increase in value. Whether it's a good investment really depends on the age of the cask and how long you are willing to age it. And then if you want to regauge your cask before resell it, we can do that for you as well. Regaging simply means to remeasure the content, understand how much is left, and understand the ABV level. You have to always regauge your cask before you sell it, just to give an updated information to the potential buyer. So storage costs and insurance costs is covered for the first 3 years by Red Vines Worldwide. If you want to further age it beyond 3 years, the cost would be £65 per cask per year. So it's a very, very minimum maintenance cost. So thank you very much. That pretty much covers everything for today. If you have any other questions, do put it on the chat room or in the Q&A. I will stay for a couple more minutes to answer your questions. If you have any other questions after today, feel free to give us a call, give us an email. We will try to, we'll find a whiskey specialist like myself to address any of your concerns or any of your questions. So let's open it up for the floor. If you have any questions, feel free to put it to the chat or the Q&A. Thank you. Can I see this record video in Facebook? No, we will not be uploading this to Facebook. However, we will be, if you want, we can send you the recording. So yeah, I'll drop that down. I will be sending you a recording. Someone asked if there will be a Cantonese session. So unfortunately, the Cantonese session this afternoon was cancelled. However, if you would like to have a Cantonese, if you want to have some Cantonese information, you can leave a name for myself. Just drop it on the chat room saying it's for panelists. Leave a name, leave your contact. We will arrange a Cantonese speaking specialist to be in touch with you. All right, someone asks for the recording as well. No problem. I will send it to your email. No problem.